Hayley Knox stared at her phone in horror, as she realized she had just sent a very private message to the wrong number, and she had no clue that the stranger who received it would change her life forever. "Oh no, no, no," Hayley muttered, clutching her phone like it might explode. She was sitting cross-legged on her tiny couch, surrounded by open textbooks, half-eaten takeout, and the general chaos that came from trying to balance nursing school and 2 part-time jobs. The message was supposed to go to her best friend, a long rant about how humiliated she felt after today's disaster at the hospital. Somehow, she'd managed to trip over her own 2 feet in front of the entire cardiac unit, including Dr. Branson, who was basically a walking Greek god. Instead, she had accidentally sent it to a random number she didn't recognize, and now whoever it was had a full front row seat to her most embarrassing thoughts. "Maybe they won't read it," she whispered, even as her stomach twisted. "Yeah, right." Like anyone could resist opening a text that started with, "I officially want to bury myself alive." Hayley flopped backward onto the couch and covered her face with a pillow. Maybe if she stayed like this long enough, she'd just disappear. Meanwhile, across the city, in a sleek penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Jaxon Ashford read the text with a stunned expression. He had been about to leave for a meeting when his phone buzzed. Expecting a work update, he opened it without thinking and found himself reading a brutally honest, hilarious, and oddly vulnerable message from a complete stranger. Jaxon couldn't remember the last time something made him laugh out loud like that, or made him feel curious. He glanced at the clock. The meeting could wait. Instead, he leaned against the glass wall, staring out at the skyline, rereading the text. There was something about the rawness, the humor, the way she didn't seem to take herself too seriously even as she was clearly hurting. It tugged at something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time. Without overthinking it, he decided he needed to meet her. The next afternoon, Hayley was balancing a tray of coffee cups at the cafe where she worked weekends when someone new walked in. She noticed him instantly. It would have been impossible not to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for a year, but he didn't have the stiff, arrogant vibe most rich guys did. There was something relaxed about the way he carried himself, like he was used to being in charge but didn't need to prove it. Their eyes met for half a second. Hayley quickly looked away, cheeks flushing. Rich, gorgeous men were not part of her world. She dropped off the coffees at a table and was heading back to the counter when he stepped into line. When it was his turn, he smiled at her, a real, warm smile that made her heart trip over itself. "Hi," he said, voice low and smooth. "I'm new here. Any recommendations?" Hayley blinked. Was he flirting? No, no way. She cleared her throat. If you like sweet, the caramel latte's pretty popular. If you're more into strong coffee, the espresso's good." "I'll take whatever you like," he said with a grin that made her knees a little weak. Flustered, she rang up a caramel latte and ducked behind the espresso machine. As she worked, she couldn't help sneaking glances at him. He was leaning casually against the counter, watching her with an unreadable expression. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed and she swore she felt a spark. "Thank you, Hayley," he said, reading her name off her name tag. She smiled awkwardly. "You're welcome. Sir," he laughed, low and rich. "Jaxon?" Then he turned and walked out, leaving her staring after him like an idiot. Over the next week, Jaxon became a regular. He always came during her shifts, always ordered whatever she recommended, always stayed just a little longer than necessary, chatting with her when there was a lull. Hayley found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. He was funny, easy to talk to, and surprisingly down to earth, despite the obvious signs that he was loaded the fancy watch, the sleek black car she'd caught a glimpse of outside. But he never made her feel small or unimportant. Still, she had no idea who he really was. And she definitely didn't connect him to the mysterious stranger who had received her accidental text, not when he acted like he was just another guy getting coffee. One evening after a long shift, Hayley was wiping down tables when Jaxon approached. "Hey," he said, a little more serious than usual. "Are you free for dinner?" She blinked. "Like now?" He smiled. "Yeah, I know a place, no pressure." Hayley hesitated. She was exhausted in her worn-out sneakers and apron, and she probably smelled like coffee grounds, but something in his eyes made her say, "Okay." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the passenger seat of a sleek black Aston Martin, trying not to gawk at the luxury around her. Jaxon drove them to a restaurant she'd only ever seen in magazines, a rooftop place with twinkling fairy lights, live music, and a view of the whole city. "Are you sure we're allowed in here?" she whispered as he handed the keys to the valet. He laughed. "Pretty sure." When they were seated at a private table with a perfect view, Hayley fidgeted with her napkin. "This is a little out of my league," she admitted. Jaxon leaned forward, voice low and earnest. "You're not out of place, Hayley. You belong anywhere you want to be." She swallowed hard, heart pounding. Dinner was incredible. He ordered for them expensive champagne, dishes she couldn't pronounce but never made her feel self-conscious. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about nursing school, about how she wanted to work in pediatrics someday. He listened like every word mattered. He shared little pieces of himself too, how he worked in investments, how he traveled a lot but missed having real connections. By the end of the night, Hayley felt like she was floating. As they walked back to the car, Jaxon brushed his hand against hers and then, slowly, twined their fingers together. Hayley looked up at him, heart hammering. He smiled, soft and a little shy for the first time. "I've been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you," she laughed, breathless. "You're insane." "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not wrong." When he dropped her off at her apartment, he didn't try to kiss her. He just squeezed her hand and said, "Good night, Hayley." And for the first time in a long time, she went to bed smiling. What she didn't know was that Jaxon was already falling fast and hard for the woman who had accidentally sent him a text that turned his whole world upside down. Hayley stood in front of her closet, towel wrapped around her, dripping onto the worn hardwood floor. She stared at the handful of outfits she owned that weren't scrubs or coffee-stained uniforms and bit her lip. Nothing in there screamed date with a man who eats at rooftop restaurants. Except, was it even a date? He hadn't said the word. She grabbed a simple navy dress, the least wrinkled thing she had, and tugged it on. Her hands trembled a little as she zipped it up. Downstairs, a low honk sounded. She peeked out the window and felt her breath catch. A sleek silver Maserati idled at the curb, glinting under the streetlights. Jaxon stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, looking like he'd just walked out of a magazine. She hurried down, feeling completely out of place in her scuffed flats, but he smiled the moment he saw her, like she was the only thing that mattered. "You look incredible," he said, opening the car door for her. She laughed nervously. "You must need glasses." He tilted his head, studying her. "Nope, vision's perfect." The drive was quiet at first, the city lights flashing past. Hayley tried not to fidget, aware of how different their worlds were. She didn't even know where they were going this time. "So," Jaxon said, glancing at her with a glint of mischief, "ever been on a boat?" She blinked. "A boat, like a ferry," he chuckled, a rich sound that made her stomach flutter for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. "Not exactly." They pulled up to a private dock where a gleaming yacht waited, decked out with soft lights and a small crew bustling quietly in the background. Hayley's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jaxon came around to open her door again. "Come on, trust me. Trust him." The words hung between them as he offered his hand. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she placed hers in his, letting him guide her onto the yacht. The moment they stepped aboard, the city noise faded away, replaced by the soft lapping of water and the faint strains of live jazz from somewhere below deck. "Is this yours?" she asked, feeling utterly ridiculous the moment the question left her lips. He shrugged casually. "I use it sometimes." She didn't press. Something told her pushing for details would only make her feel more like an outsider. Instead, she followed him to a table set at the bow, candles flickering in the breeze. A waiter appeared as if by magic, offering a tray of appetizers that looked too pretty to eat. Hayley picked at a tiny, delicate pastry, feeling wildly out of her depth. "Relax," Jaxon said, his voice low and reassuring. "This isn't a test." She gave a shaky laugh. "Feels like one. Pretty sure I'm failing." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "You're the most real person I've met in a long time." She looked away, embarrassed. That's probably just because I have no idea what fork to use. He laughed again, but there was no mockery in it. Only something softer, deeper. They ate as the yacht drifted away from the dock, the skyline shrinking behind them. The stars emerged overhead, faint but determined against the city's light pollution. Between courses, conversation flowed more easily. She told him about growing up with her grandmother after her parents' accident, about how she worked summers at the library to save for nursing school. Jaxon listened, leaning in like every word was precious. "You've built everything yourself," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "No safety net, no shortcuts." Hayley shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "It's just life, you do what you have to." He was silent for a moment, then said, "I had every shortcut handed to me, every safety net, but none of it ever felt like it mattered." She frowned, not sure what to say. He smiled faintly. "Which is probably why I'm here on a boat trying to impress a girl who thinks a ferry is fancy." Hayley laughed, tension easing. "Well, mission accomplished. I'm officially impressed." As dessert arrived, some kind of elaborate chocolate sculpture, Hayley leaned back, watching the lights of the shoreline twinkle in the distance. "This feels like a dream," she said without thinking. Jaxon reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "It's real, Hayley." Her heart stumbled in her chest. She squeezed his fingers lightly, trying to ground herself. After dinner, he led her to the upper deck, where a cozy seating area overlooked the dark water. They sat close, the night cool but not cold. Jaxon draped a soft throw blanket over her shoulders without a word. She tilted her head back, looking at the stars. "You ever wonder if there's more?" she asked quietly. "More than all this." He was silent for a long moment. "Every day," he said finally. She turned to look at him. His face was half-shadowed, but his eyes were clear, unguarded. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek. He turned his head just enough that their lips brushed. A slow, careful kiss that deepened with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they pulled apart, Hayley's breath caught. "I should probably tell you," he said, voice low and rough. "I'm not who you think I am." Fear pricked at her, but she forced herself to stay still. "Then tell me." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet. I don't want to ruin this." Hayley searched his face, seeing the war inside him. "Okay," she said softly. "But don't wait too long." He smiled, a real one this time, and pulled her closer. As they sat there, wrapped in a blanket and each other, Hayley realized she was already in deeper than she'd ever intended. And something told her this was only the beginning. Hayley tapped her fingers nervously against the armrest as the Maserati purred down the quiet road. The yacht ride had left her dizzy, not from the swaying of the water, but from the way Jaxon had looked at her like she was the only real thing in his world. He hadn't pressed for anything more after that lingering kiss under the stars, but the air between them now felt charged, like something was waiting to break loose. As they pulled up to her building, she turned toward him, heart hammering. "Thank you for tonight," she said, voice soft. "It was unexpected." Jaxon brushed his thumb lightly over the edge of the steering wheel, his gaze locked on her face. "I don't do things halfway, Hayley, not when it matters." She swallowed hard, the meaning in his words wrapping around her chest like a vise. "Good night," she whispered, slipping from the car before she lost her nerve. Inside her apartment, the silence pressed in. She leaned back against the door, breathing out slowly. Her mind was a mess of images. The glittering city skyline, the warmth of his hand over hers, the way his voice had gone rough when he said he wasn't who she thought he was. The next morning, Hayley's alarm blared far too early. She dragged herself through her nursing shifts, her thoughts never far from Jaxon. It wasn't just the yacht or the dinners, it was the way he listened, the way he made her feel like she wasn't just surviving, but actually living. Midweek, she found herself restocking supplies in pediatrics when a bouquet so massive it could have hidden a small child arrived at the nurse's station. A nurse waved her over, grinning. "These are for you, Hayley." Heat rushed to her cheeks. She hurried over, heart in her throat. Nestled among the blooms was a small card handwritten, "Dinner tonight," where something comfortable. No last name, no logo, just a simple note that sent her pulse racing. After work, she darted home, showered, and threw on her favorite worn jeans and a soft sweater. She barely had time to catch her breath before the knock came, Opening the door, she found Jaxon standing there in dark jeans and a casual jacket, looking devastatingly handsome and somehow even more dangerous to her equilibrium dressed down. "You look perfect," he said, eyes gleaming. "Where are we going?" she asked, slipping into her sneakers. He grinned. "You'll see." They drove out of the city, the skyline fading behind them. Hayley watched the world blur by, nerves and excitement tangling in her stomach. Eventually, they pulled into a quiet property surrounded by trees. A stone path wound up to a small, rustic villa glowing warmly with lights. "Is this your house?" she asked, stepping out into the cool air. "One of them," he said easily, locking the car. "I come here when I need to breathe." She followed him up the path, her sneakers crunching against gravel. Inside, the house was surprisingly cozy, high ceilings, a crackling fireplace, shelves lined with books and old records. It was a world away from the polished, glossy image he usually wore like armor. Jaxon tossed his keys into a bowl and turned to her. "Hungry," she laughed, tension easing. "Starving." Instead of a fancy chef, he led her into the kitchen where he pulled ingredients from the fridge, fresh vegetables, pasta, herbs. "You cook," she said, genuinely surprised. He chuckled. "I learned early." Turns out, money doesn't make a great lasagna appear out of thin air. As they chopped and stirred, Hayley found herself relaxing more than she had in weeks. They teased each other over the best way to dice an onion, argued playfully about whether garlic should be measured with a spoon or instinct. When dinner was ready, they ate by the fire, plates balanced on their knees. Between bites of perfectly imperfect pasta, Hayley glanced at him. "You said you're not who I think you are. I'm still waiting." Jaxon set his plate down, his expression growing serious. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "My family's old money," he said. "Ashford Enterprises, real estate, banking, investments. I grew up knowing I'd eventually take over." Hayley blinked. She'd heard of the Ashfords, anyone who even glanced at a newspaper had. "They were practically American royalty. But I didn't want it," he continued. "At least, not the way they did it. I started my own investment firm when I was 22. Built it from nothing but a few stubborn ideas and a lot of reckless optimism." She stared, trying to reconcile the man in jeans beside her with the Wall Street headlines she'd skimmed over in her economics class. "And now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Now I'm worth enough to buy a small country," Jaxon said, grimacing slightly. "But most days it feels like the more I have, the less real everything gets." Hayley set her plate aside, crossing her legs beneath her. "And me?" she asked, heart thudding. "Where do I fit into all that?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, like she was the first clear thing he'd seen in years. "You're the first thing that's felt real in a long time," he said simply. The room went very still. Hayley's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt, but a lifetime of being second best, of being left behind, made her wary. "I don't belong in your world," she said, voice shaking. Jaxon's jaw tightened. He reached out, gently capturing her hand in his. "Then I'll build one we both belong in," he said. "Starting with this." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood, pulling her up with him. He crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a dusty record, setting it spinning on an old player. Soft, crackling jazz filled the room. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." Hayley hesitated, then placed her hand in his. They swayed slowly, awkward at first, then easier, the world outside the villa disappearing until there was only the warmth of his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She wasn't sure how long they danced. Minutes. Hours, a lifetime. Eventually, he pulled back just enough to tilt her chin up, his eyes dark and intent. "I'm not asking you to change, Hayley," he said, voice rough. "I'm asking you to trust me." She searched his face, finding only sincerity. The walls she'd spent years building cracked, just a little. "Okay," she whispered. And for the first time since this insane, impossible connection had started, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. The morning sunlight spilled through the villa's tall windows, casting pale gold across the wooden floors. Hayley stretched beneath the thick blanket Jaxon had draped over her hours ago when she dozed off on the couch. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the soft crackle of the still burning fire, savoring the rare feeling of peace. The distant clatter of dishes pulled her upright. She pushed her hair back and padded toward the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee beckoning her. Jaxon stood at the counter barefoot, sleeves rolled up, whisking something in a large bowl. His hair was slightly messy, and there was a dusting of flour on his forearm. "You're dangerous," Hayley said, crossing her arms with a teasing smile. "First yachts, now breakfast. You're setting the bar way too high." He glanced over his shoulder, grinning, a whisk held hostage in his hand. "Well, you deserve more than a granola bar and gas station coffee," Hayley laughed, leaning against the doorframe. "What are you making? Pancakes, or attempting to anyway?" "No promises." She stepped forward and peered into the bowl. "You're supposed to let the batter rest before you cook them." He raised a brow. "You're full of secrets." "You have no idea," she said lightly, stealing a strawberry from the counter. As Jaxon poured batter onto the griddle, Hayley wandered around the kitchen, noticing little details she hadn't seen last night. A battered leather journal tucked between cookbooks, an old record player with a stack of vinyls leaning beside it, a framed photo of a younger Jaxon standing beside an older man in front of a race car. She picked up the photo, curiosity prickling. "Who's this?" Jaxon flipped a pancake and glanced over. "My uncle. He raised me after my parents weren't around." The hesitation in his voice told her enough. She didn't push. "He taught me everything that mattered," Jaxon added, setting a plate of steaming pancakes on the table. "Everything else I had to unlearn." Hayley set the photo down gently. "He sounds like a good man." "The best," Jaxon said quietly. They ate by the window, watching the morning mist lift from the trees. Hayley found herself telling him about the tiny town where she'd grown up, the summers she'd spent reading every book the library owned just to escape for a little while. "You know," Jaxon said, sipping his coffee, "you talk about it like it was nothing, but building something out of nothing is rare." Hayley shrugged, embarrassed. "It wasn't some grand, heroic thing, it was just surviving." "Maybe surviving is heroic," he said, his voice low and certain. They cleared the dishes together, moving easily around each other. When Hayley reached for a glass on a high shelf and couldn't quite get it, Jaxon stepped behind her and retrieved it without a word, his hand brushing hers in a way that made her breath hitch. As they finished, Jaxon dried his hands on a towel and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him outside, past the villa, down a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. The morning air was crisp, the ground damp with dew. They walked in silence until the trees opened onto a wide clearing. In the center stood the beginnings of a house frame's sturdy beams, a solid foundation, but still very much a work in progress. Hayley stared, unsure what she was seeing. "I bought this land a few years ago," Jaxon said, his voice steady. "It was supposed to be a retreat, a place to get away when the city got too loud, but I never built anything because it felt pointless, empty." She turned to him, heart pounding. "I want to finish it now," he continued, meeting her eyes. "I want to build something real, something lasting, and I want you to be part of it." Hayley's throat closed up. She shook her head slightly, overwhelmed. "Jaxon, this is crazy, we barely know each other." He stepped closer, every line of his body tense but sure. "I know enough. I know you're the only person who's ever seen me, not the money or the name. Just me." She looked at the unfinished house, at the strong beams standing against the sky, stubborn and brave. "I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow," Jaxon said, voice gentler now. "I'm asking you to believe in something with me, to give this a real chance." Hayley wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of everything she'd fought so hard to protect, her independence, her safety, her heart. But when she looked at Jaxon, she didn't see danger. She saw possibility. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said, "but I'm more scared of never trying." The wind stirred the trees around them, carrying the scent of earth and pine and something new. Slowly, Hayley stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, frantic beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I want to try," she said, voice shaking but sure. "With you." Relief and joy lit his face in a way that made her knees weak. Jaxon cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and deep, like a man anchoring himself to something precious. When they finally pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm not letting you go," he murmured. "Not ever." Later that afternoon, back at the villa, Hayley found a small velvet box tucked into the pocket of her jacket. She opened it with trembling fingers to find a delicate gold bracelet, simple and elegant with one tiny charm, a compass. Inside the lid of the box was a handwritten note, "Wherever life takes us, you're my true north." Tears blurred her vision. She clasped the bracelet around her wrist, feeling the weight of it, the promise it carried. Outside, Jaxon waited by the car, the autumn sunlight catching in his hair, his expression open and unguarded. Hayley stepped into his arms without hesitation. They drove back toward the city together, the road stretching out before them, wide and full of possibility. For the first time in her life, Hayley wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And she was exactly where she was meant to be. Hayley tugged nervously at the hem of her dress as Jaxon led her through the grand, arched doorway of the ballroom. The space glittered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, the marble floors shining like a mirror beneath the swirling mass of dancers. String music filled the air, elegant and rich, as waiters in crisp white jackets floated through the crowd with trays of champagne. She tried not to gape. It wasn't just the sheer opulence of the place. It was the knowledge that she was entering Jaxon's world now not as a visitor, but as someone he wanted by his side. "This isn't exactly jeans and pancakes," Hayley whispered, her voice barely carrying over the music. Jaxon bent close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "You make this place look better just by being here." A flush warmed her cheeks, but she managed a shaky smile. She wasn't sure she would ever get used to the way he said things like that, so genuine, without a trace of irony. They crossed the ballroom, heads turning as they passed. Jaxon Ashford was not a man people ignored, and now neither was she. She could feel the curious glances, the speculative whispers just beneath the surface of the polite smiles. "Doesn't it bother you?" Hayley asked as he guided her onto the dance floor, his hand steady at her waist. All the attention. He spun her into a slow waltz, his movements smooth and effortless. "Not when I'm with you," he said simply. They danced through 2 songs before a silver-haired man approached, his presence commanding. He was flanked by 2 younger men in dark suits, their expressions guarded. Hayley tensed, recognizing the resemblance immediately. "Jaxon's uncle." "Jaxon," the man said, his voice deep and measured. Introducing someone new tonight, Jaxon's grip on her hand tightened just slightly, a silent reassurance. "Uncle Robert, this is Hayley Knox." Robert's gaze swept over her, assessing but not unkind. "I see," he said after a moment. "It's been a long time since you brought anyone to an Ashford event." Hayley lifted her chin, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his scrutiny. "It's nice to meet you, sir." Robert's mouth quirked into something that might have been approval. "Likewise, Miss Knox. I hope you know what you're getting into." "I think I'm starting to," she said, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her reply. Robert gave a short nod, then clapped Jaxon on the shoulder. "Don't let them eat you alive, boy." As he and his entourage moved away, Hayley exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You handled that better than I did my first time," Jaxon said, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "Was that some kind of test?" she asked, half teasing. "Everything in this world is a test." His expression sobered. "But you passed without even trying." They slipped away from the dance floor after a while, weaving through the maze of gilded columns and velvet drapes, until they found a quiet terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a balm against the heat of the ballroom. Hayley leaned against the balustrade, looking out over the neatly trimmed hedges and sparkling fountains. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Normalcy." Jaxon stepped beside her, his hand brushing against hers. "Sometimes, but then I think about what I really want." He turned to her fully, his features lit by the soft glow of the garden lights. "You," he said. "I want you, Hayley, not the parties, not the headlines, just you." Hayley's throat tightened. She had spent so long bracing herself for disappointment, for the moment when the dream would shatter. But it hadn't. It was unfolding right in front of her, terrifying and beautiful. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "So am I," Jaxon said, echoing the words they had once shared. "But some things are worth the risk." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, different from the one he had given her before. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "No," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. Yes, he said, smiling that rare, unguarded smile that melted every wall she had left. He dropped to one knee, right there on the terrace, the sounds of the party fading into nothing. Hayley Knox, you changed my life the second you stumbled into it. You showed me what it means to build something real, to feel something real. I don't want a future that doesn't have you in it. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision as she nodded frantically, unable to form words. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a delicate band with a single, brilliant diamond, and stood, pulling her into his arms. She kissed him fiercely, laughter and tears mixing between them. When they finally broke apart, Hayley pressed her forehead to his. "You're crazy, Jaxon Ashford. Only about you," he murmured. They returned to the ballroom hand in hand, the sparkling ring catching the light with every step. Words spread quickly, glances shifting from curious to congratulatory. But Hayley barely noticed. She only had eyes for the man beside her, the man who had turned her entire world upside down with a text sent to the wrong number. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Hayley stood in the clearing where the house had once been nothing but a skeleton of beams. Now it was a home. The walls were up, the windows framed the endless stretch of trees, and the porch wrapped lazily around the front like an open invitation to stay a while. It wasn't grand or ostentatious. It was warm, inviting, real. Jaxon stood beside her, his arm around her waist, both of them barefoot on the newly laid wooden floors. "You did it," Hayley said, resting her head against his shoulder. "We did it," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her hair. Inside, the walls were still bare, the paint fresh. A single photo already hung above the fireplace, a candid shot of them laughing on the yacht, caught in a moment of pure, reckless happiness. Hayley turned in his arms, looping her hands around his neck. "Ready to start forever," she whispered. He smiled, that boyish, heart-stealing smile she would never get tired of seeing. "I've been ready since the moment you sent me that text." He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her across the threshold as she laughed, the sound echoing through their new home. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a soft, golden light. There were no more uncertainties, no more half-finished dreams, only love, only them, only forever.